I look at my hands now, spotted with age and trembling with a palsy that has nothing to do with the cold, and I wonder if they are the same hands. Memory is a liar, a thief that reshapes the past to fit the shape of our regrets. But I remember the grease. That is the one thing that remains true. In Stuttgart, the grease smelled of lanolin and warm brass. It was a heavy, sweet scent that clung to the pores of my skin, the smell of order, of civilization. I was a creature of the factory floor, a man who understood that if gear A turned at a specific velocity, gear B would respond in kind. There was a logic to it, a comfort. Here in the hole in the earth that passed for a home, the grease smelled of petroleum and frozen rot. It was the smell of the Eastern Front. I sat on a crate of ammunition, the wood damp enough to rot the seat of my trousers, and disassembled the bolt of the car 98K. The metal was biting to the touch, a cold so profound it felt like a burn. My fingers, however, moved with a memory of their own. They did not belong to Heinrich Vogel, the shivering soldier in the Feldgrau greatcoat. They belonged to Heinrich the assembler. Pin, spring, extractor. The pieces were laid out on a rag that had once been a shirt, arranged in a perfect grid. The other men, they treated their weapons like shovels, tools to be battered and abused. To me, the rifle was a mechanism of time. If the tolerance was off by a fraction of a millimeter, the bullet would not meet the history it was intended for. "You're doing it again, Vogel," a voice rasped. It was Weber. He was young, barely 20, with a face that still held the softness of a boy who expected his mother to call him for supper. He was huddled in the corner of the dugout, knees pulled to his chest. "Doing what?" I asked, not looking up. I was polishing the rear lens of the telescopic sight. A smudge there was the difference between life and death. Treating that thing like it's made of glass. "It's a killing machine, not a pocket watch." "It is a machine," I corrected, my voice sounding hollow in the confined space. "And like all machines, it fails if you do not respect the friction." I didn't tell him that focusing on the mechanism was the only thing keeping the screaming out of my head. I had received the letter 2 days ago with the supply truck. It sat in my breast pocket, a rectangle of stiff paper that felt heavier than the rifle. Stuttgart was burning. My mother wrote of firestorms that sucked the oxygen from the cellars, of the British bombers that droned overhead like angry hornets in the night. She wrote that the windows of our apartment had been blown out, that the air tasted of ash. I was here 1,000 kilometers away, sitting in the mud near Gomel, guarding a frozen line of nothingness while my world burned behind me. The logic of it escaped me. In the factory, if a machine malfunctioned, you stopped the line. You fixed it. Here the machine was broken, grinding itself to pieces, and we were just feeding it more meat. Weber shifted, pulling a photograph from his tunic. I knew the image by heart without looking. His wife holding a baby he had never seen. He rubbed his thumb over their faces, over and over, wearing the paper thin. The sound of his thumb on the paper, a soft, dry scuffing, was louder to me than the distant, low rumble of the Soviet artillery that had been pounding the horizon for days. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" Weber asked, his voice tight. "The Ivans," I reassembled the bolt, the steel sliding home with a satisfying, oily solidity. "The ground is hard enough. If they have the tanks, they will come. I have a bad feeling." "Heinrich, you always have a bad feeling. Keep your head down and your socks dry." I lifted the rifle, looking through the scope. The optics were clear, a perfect circle of magnified gray light. Through it, the world was manageable. Framed, detached. I could verify the distance to the tree line, 600 meters. I could calculate the windage. I could control this small circle of reality. Outside the scope, I was powerless. I could not stop the bombers over Stuttgart. I could not warm the earths. I could only ensure that the firing pins struck the primer with the requisite force. The silence of the sector was a deception. We called it the quiet front. But silence in Russia was just a predator holding its breath. Then the air shattered. It wasn't a bomb. It was a whistle, followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting the duckboards. The canvas flap of our dugout was ripped aside, letting in a blast of freezing wind and the frantic face of Unteroffizier Kral. "Vogel, Weber, gear up, we're moving, moving." Weber scrambled up, dropping his photo in the mud before snatching it back. Well, we just got the stove working. Gomel's sector is collapsing. Kral spat, his eyes wide and white in the gloom. Ivan has crossed the river. We're plugging the gap. Move, damn you, move. I looked at my rifle, then at the scattered tools on the rag. I swept them into my pouch with a singular, fluid motion. The factory was closed. The shift was over. I stood up, the joints of my knees popping, and felt the weight of the war settle back onto my shoulders. I looked at Weber. He was shaking, his eyes darting around the dugout as if looking for a place to hide. Breathe, Weber, I said, though I felt the cold coil of dread in my own stomach. Not for me, but for the futility of it. We were marching into the grinder. The march was a descent into a mechanical hell. We left the static geometry of the trenches for the open chaos of the road. The mud had frozen into jagged ruts that twisted ankles and broke the wheels of the carts. We were not a regiment anymore. We were a stream of gray greatcoats flowing towards the fire. Gomel was not a city. It was a wound on the horizon, glowing with the dull orange light of burning buildings. The noise hit us before we even saw the river. It was a wall of sound, a continuous, grinding roar that vibrated in the teeth and the bones. The Dnieper was the dividing line, the threshold between the waiting and the dying. My mind retreated to the only sanctuary I had. I analyzed the movement of the column like a watchmaker, diagnosing a timing error. The spacing was poor. The tempo was erratic. We were a mainspring wound too tight, ready to snap. Artillery, someone screamed, though the warning was superfluous. The air pressure dropped, a physical sensation that sucked the air from my lungs. Then the earth heaved. The sound was not a noise, but a physical blow. A geyser of black earth and white snow erupted 50 meters to our right. Then another, closer. The precision of the barrage was terrifying. They were walking the shells toward us, adjusting the range with mathematical cruelty. Scatter, Kral roared. I dove into a shallow depression, the instinct of the animal overriding the logic of the man. The ground shook violently, rattling my helmet against my skull. Dirt and shrapnel rained down, pattering against my coat like hail. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the distinct, tearing sound of a scream cut short. I lifted my head. Weber was gone. In his place was a crater, smoking in the cold air. A few meters away, a boot lay on its side, the laces still tied in a double knot. I stared at it. A double knot. He had tied it that morning to keep his feet secure. A small, meticulous act of preparation. Now it was just debris. Forward. Don't stop, the order came from everywhere and nowhere. We were pushed forward not by courage, but by the sheer momentum of the panic behind us. We reached the outskirts of a village near the river crossing. The buildings were skeletons, ribs of charred timber poking into the gray sky. The Soviet infantry was probing the line, testing the tension. Bullets snapped through the air, making sounds like angry insects. I pressed myself against the remnants of a brick wall, trying to slow my heart rate. A sniper cannot shoot between heartbeats if the heart is hammering like a piston engine. To my left, a corporal, a man I didn't know, with the red stripes of the artillery on his collar, was frantically tugging at the bolt of his weapon. He was hyperventilating, his hands slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature. He was hammering on the bolt handle with the palm of his hand, making it worse. "It's jammed," he screamed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "It won't cycle." I looked at him. I looked at the weapon. It was a standard issue car 98K, identical to mine. I saw the problem instantly. He had forced the bolt while a casing failed to eject. The extractor had slipped. It was a mechanical deadlock. "Give it here," I said. My voice was calm, startlingly so. "What?" I didn't argue. I reached out and ripped the rifle from his grip. The world around us was exploding, mortar rounds pulverizing the cobblestones. The chatter of a Soviet machine gun chewing up the facade of the building above us. But I focused on the steel in my hands. I didn't force it. Force breaks gears. I applied pressure to the extractor claw. Using the tip of a cartridge, I pulled from my belt as a lever. I felt the tension release, a subtle give in the metal. With a sharp, precise twist, I racked the bolt back. The spent casing spun out, landing in the snow with a hiss. I pushed the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round into the chamber, and engaged the safety. I handed it back to him. The extractor spring is weak. Do not slam it. Treat it gently. The corporal stared at me, his mouth agape, then at the rifle. He nodded a grim, bewildered acknowledgement of the miracle. I had fixed the machine. For a second the chaos had an order. Vogel, I turned. It was Lieutenant Steiner. He looked ragged, his uniform torn, his eyes burning with the fever of command in a collapsing situation. He was pointing a gloved finger toward the river. Standing alone on a small rise overlooking the pontoon bridge was a church. It had been shelled repeatedly. The roof was gone, and the steeple was a jagged finger of masonry pointing accusingly at heaven. It was the highest point in the sector. It commanded the crossing. It was also a suicide trap. Every Soviet gunner on the other side of the river would be looking at it. Vogel, Steiner shouted over the roar of a mortar impact. That's your perch. You have the long glass. Get up there. Delay them. Hold the crossing until the Großdeutschland division gets here. Delay them, I asked, looking at the skeletal tower. It looked like a broken tooth. If they cross that bridge, the flank collapses. You buy us time. That is an order. I looked at the tower, then at the river where the gray shapes of Soviet infantry were beginning to mass. I felt the weight of my rifle, the smooth wood of the stock. I was a watchmaker being asked to stop time itself. Jowl, Herr Lieutenant, I said softly. I turned toward the church, my boots heavy in the mud, walking toward the tomb that had been prepared for me. The stairs of the steeple were rotten wood, groaning under my weight like the bones of old men. I climbed into the open mouth of the sky. The wind up there was not just cold. It was personal. It sought the gaps in my greatcoat, biting at the skin. I cleared a space in the rubble, arranging my tools with the muscle memory of the factory floor. Rifle, ammunition clips, spotting scope. I settled into the dust and became stone. The first 12 hours were a test of patience. The Soviet scouts were careless. They moved through the raids like wild boars. Range, 400 meters. Wind, a gentle drift from the east. I adjusted the elevation drum. The mechanism of the rifle was smooth, a perfect assembly of steel and wood. I exhaled. I squeezed. The recoil punched my shoulder, a familiar, violent shove. Down in the reeds, a gray shape collapsed. I worked the bolts. The brass casing ejected, spinning in the air, catching the weak sunlight before vanishing into the debris. One gear removed. The machine of the enemy advance stuttered, then stopped. Then came the silence. It was heavier than the noise. I lay prone, the stone biting into my elbows. My stomach was a hollow pit, gnawed at by rats of hunger. Darkness fell, and the temperature plummeted. I could not move to keep warm. Movement was death. I had to be a statue. I stared into the blackness until my eyes watered, shapes dancing in the periphery. By the second day, the thirst was a fever. My tongue was a piece of dry leather in my mouth. The wind howling through the jagged masonry began to change pitch. It wasn't wind anymore. It was the whistle. The 5 a.m. shift whistle from the factory in Stuttgart. I shook my head, trying to clear the sound. It persisted, a high shrieking demand to get to the workbench, to assemble the escapements, to make the watches tick. But I wasn't at my bench. I was in a tomb in the sky. Below me, the landscape was a gray blur. Then, a splash of color. Red, a Soviet medic scrambled out from behind a burnt truck. He wasn't charging. He was crawling toward a wounded man, dragging a satchel. He was trying to fix something. He was a mechanic of flesh, trying to repair the damage the war had done. I tracked him in the scope. The crosshairs settled on his helmet. He was doing his duty, just as I was doing mine. To pull the trigger was to destroy the very idea of healing. It was to kill the part of myself that used to build things. My finger tightened. The factory whistle screamed in my head. The rifle bucked. The medic fell across his patient. The red cross was swallowed by the mud. I cycled the bolt. I felt cold, not from the weather, but from the inside. The mainspring of my conscience had finally snapped. I was no longer Heinrich. I was just an extension of the optical sight. 48 hours. My body was vibrating with exhaustion. I was out of water. I had 3 rounds left. Then I saw them, behind my position, emerging from the tree line. Field gray uniforms. The relief column. They were marching in column formation, rifles slung, confident that the sector was clear. They did not see the tree line to the west. I had been watching that tree line for hours. I knew what was in there. The Soviets had moved a Maxim gun into position under the cover of darkness. The Germans were walking into a meat grinder. I was safe. I was hidden in the clouds. If I stayed silent, I would live. If I fired, I gave away my position to every gun on the riverbank. I looked at the relief column. Young faces, unshaven, tired. I looked at the hidden Soviet nest. I adjusted my sights one last time. I wasn't aiming at a soldier. I was aiming at fate. I took a breath that rattled in my fluid-filled lungs. I fired. The shot hit the shield of the Maxim gun with a ringing clang that echoed across the valley. The silence shattered. The Soviet gun opened up, but not at me. It tore into the relief column. The valley erupted. I slumped back against the cold stone, the rifle slipping from my numb fingers. The world dissolved into a cacophony of screaming metal and tearing earth. Survival is a strange punishment. They found me 2 days later. The steeple had been hit by a tank shell, half of it sheared away. But I was curled in the corner of what remained, covered in white dust, a ghost haunting his own grave. I was the only one left. The relief column I had tried to save was gone, decimated in the ambush. My warning had bought them a few seconds of terror. Nothing more. The sector had fallen. I was carried down from the tower, a hollow thing. The man who went up those stairs never came down. 70 years later. The light in the workshop is soft, filtered through dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. It smells of cedar oil and old brass. My hands are spotted with age, the skin like parchment paper. They tremble now, a essential tremor. The doctor calls it. But when I pick up the tweezers, when I hold the breath in my lungs, the shaking stops. For a moment, I look down at the pocket watch on the velvet pad. It is a Lange and Sirhan shattered face, bent hands, a complex mechanism that has ceased to function. I spent my youth in the factory of war, the assembly line of destruction. We were told we were building a 1,000-year empire, but we were only building ruins. We took apart the world piece by piece. We disassembled men, families, cities. We stripped the gears of civilization until nothing moved, until the hands of the clock stood still over a frozen wasteland. I pick up a tiny brass cog with the tweezers. It is the escape wheel. It regulates the release of energy. It controls the chaos. I fit it gently into the pivot hole. It clicks into place. A perfect fit. A watchmaker understands that every small piece has a purpose. If one gear is broken, the whole machine fails. In war, you are told you are a piece of a great machine. But that machine is designed only to break things. It grinds its own gears into dust. The real war, the one that lasts a lifetime, is learning how to put your own pieces back together again. I apply a drop of oil to the jewel. I wind the crown. Slowly, carefully, the balance wheel begins to oscillate. The sound is loud in the quiet room. It is the sound of order. It is the sound of a heart starting to beat again after a long, cold winter. But beneath the ticking, if I listen closely, I can still hear the silence of the steeple. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.